Welcome to Ubuntu Architecture Summer Abroad. My name is Wandile Mthiyane. I am the director and founder of Ubuntu Architecture Summer Abroad, and I'm really excited to have you here today. This is an amazing and revolutionary program that teaches architecture from the lens of vernacular African architecture, teaches architecture with purpose, where we design something that's actually going to impact a community, a family, and change the lives of people. And I think that's a good segue as we start, because when you think of architecture, you can't think of architecture outside of leadership, even though that's often what we try to do and run away from. But architects, at the fundamental core, are the leaders, because we lead how people live. You wouldn't be sitting in that chair the way you're sitting and watching this video if someone hadn't designed it to be that way. We dictate we dictate how people end up living. So it is a very important role and responsibility that we've been given, and we can either use it for good or we can use it for bad. And then this course will delve deep into what that looks like. I think one of the most important things about leadership is that we've often segregated the idea of leadership to a sort of like a remnant few, right? So whether it be the Nelson Mandelas who, fought apartheid in South Africa, or it's Martin Luther King who led the civil rights movement. And the idea behind us putting these icons as the only people to qualify to have the position or the title of leadership is because of this false notion that they just woke up one day and led the civil rights movement, or they just woke up one day and fought apartheid. But in reality, that was a culmination of several daily decisions that they had to make throughout their lives. They had to intentionally choose to fight for the world as it ought to be versus the world as is. And as architects, we've been given that same responsibility. It's like, do we use architecture just to reflect things as they are, or do we use architecture to start shaping the world as it ought to be, working with these local communities who are often overlooked? I think President Obama put it best when he said, during the summer, he would have all these interns come in from all these top institutions. And at the end of the internship, at the end of the summer, he would bring them all together and have a Q&A. And they would ask all these smart questions, but eventually one of them would ask, so how do I become president? Now that's made him chuckle, because it's like, well, he says, when I was 23 years old in Colombia, I wasn't thinking about how to become president. It's like I was probably chasing girls in Colombia, but in reality, I was studying the likes of Mahatma Gandhi and the movements they were doing to liberate folks in India. He said, I was learning about the work Nelson Mandela was doing to fight apartheid in South Africa, and we had African National Congress youth who were fighting apartheid who would come and speak to us at Columbia. He's like, it was through these influences that he was able to then realize that he also had a responsibility to bring about effective change within his own community. He had a responsibility to fight the world as it ought to be, not just for people that look like him or people that come from his background, but for everyone that lives within his community. And then he says, you can't change a country without being able to change a state. You can't change a state without being able to change a city. And you can't change a city without being able to change a neighborhood. But you can't change a neighborhood, I would add, without being able to change yourself. So leadership begins with us. Leadership begins with how we view architecture, and leadership begins with how we view the contributions that we can make using our skill set of designing the world. And I think you've started on a great path because you're part of this course. And this is not, you could have taken another course at your institution or at your university, but you chose to take a course that doesn't just teach you about architecture, but it teaches you about architecture from a lens of a different culture, right? From a place that you may have never even been to. But not only that, you're learning about architecture that creates impact that's going to change the life of a family and the life of a community. Your lines are going to end up building a home for a family. And that's what impactful architecture looks like. So welcome, and I'm excited to have everyone here today. See, children around the world love to play house. And growing up in Durban, South Africa, my friends and I were no different. Well, except, our houses were too small to play house in. So we would learn from our parents' resourcefulness and build our little playhouses right next to our family's home. You see, in my community, there was no architect because everyone was an architect. When a new neighbor would walk in or come into the community, our parents would gather together and bring together their leftover scrap metals and leftover materials, and they'll put it together to build a home for them. So that's exactly what we did as kids. We'd gather all the leftover materials and we'd start building these homes, from tires to corrugated metals to cardboard. And these homes would fall on us, and we'd build it again, and it would fall, and eventually it would subside and stand. And what was interesting is that as soon as we finish building the home, we would all run to our respective homes. One will steal rice, another beans, another spices, and then we'd come together and we'd cook in our little playhouse. And playhouse with actual real food that we have cooked. In retrospect, looking back, this was not the most fire-safe thing to do, but the food sure tasted good. So this ended up defining my childhood and the childhood of all the kids within my community. We didn't have the most trending or fancy toys of the time, but we had each other. We worked together. And this taught me the importance of being resourceful, the importance of working together, the importance of playing together, and the importance of eating food that we had cooked in a house that we had built, and food that we had cooked out of, stolen ingredients from our families. So that's where the journey for me with architecture began. And then, even though my life was exciting growing up in this environment, which is what you would call an informal settlement or a shanty town, but it wasn't as exciting for my parents. Because, you see, with my parents, they had to be worried about the fact that when it rains, we had to play hide and seek with raindrops on where we put the bed. They had to worry about that if the wind got too heavy, the house may fall on us and we might not make it to the next day. They had to worry about how do they get a job when they don't have a physical address. And seeing these challenges firsthand made me want to bring about change within this space, and within the space of providing dignified housing and dignified communities that reflect people's cultures and shared values. And as a result, I decided to go study architecture. Now, the funny and interesting thing, when I got to architecture school, I quickly realized that architecture is often seen as a commodity for the rich. It was almost like whenever you spoke about affordable housing or low-income communities, that wasn't quite architecture. The architecture that was celebrated was that of obelisks, was that of objects, was that of the famous designers that we see. So whilst at school, I started pushing back and saying, what about the other 99% of folks that did not afford architecture or do not afford architects as we know and we see them today? And there was often this false notion that folks that lived in low-income communities that are lazy and they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or they're uncreative. But that couldn't be further from the truth, because growing up in these communities, I quickly realized that these are some of the most creative individuals in the world. Low-income communities are some of the most creative individuals in the world. They can make a house out of anything. And the only difference between us and them is that they lack the privilege of having the resources to build their homes. When you think of your school, when you think of our stadiums, when you think of all the built forms that we know, they are built by people that live in low-income communities. The only reason why they aren't able to do the same for themselves is because of lack of resources to be able to build structurally sound buildings. I remember vividly as if it were yesterday. I was in a design theory class and we were talking about mixed use buildings and how can we mix low income and higher income neighborhoods or higher income families into one development. And I remember a student raised up their hand and they said, I don't want to mix low income and high income earners into my development because I don't want to live next to bombs. And this hurts me, not just because I come from communities that he has just labeled bombs, but it hurts me because he had just characterized a whole group of people on things that he, one, didn't know anything about, but also conditions that they did not choose, right? And it was things like this that really made me want to use architecture as a vehicle to bring about change within low-income communities, but also to advocate and show people the reality and the creativity and the ingenuity that already exists within these communities that we come from. And that is why I started Ubuntu Design Group whilst in college, based on that fundamental premise that if apartheid architecture was so effective in segregating and oppressing, then community-led design can bring people together and enable opportunities for all. So when I was starting Ubuntu Design Group, I wanted to really use architecture as a vehicle to bring about this change in low-income communities, starting in South Africa. So when we started researching about affordable housing, we quickly realized that majority of affordable housing projects had failed. And they had failed particularly because of three reasons. Number one, affordable housing projects, when they're built, in most cases, historically and now, they're often built without consulting the people who are actually going to live there, which is ironic because every other architecture project, the key and focal point of information is us consulting the clients. But when it came to affordable housing, folks are often unconsulted. Number two, they failed because they're often built into these boxes that force people to stay within a low-income community. Whether it's stacked boxes or individual boxes, they force people to stay within that poverty bracket. And then they can never add on as they grow in number or in economy. And then number three, they failed because they're often built away from economic opportunities, which is ironic because the only reason why you have shanty towns and informal settlements is because folks are trying to move closer to work. So we wanted to essentially flip the script and do the opposite of what has historically been done by affordable housing. So the first thing that we did was we started studying different challenges within affordable housing. In South Africa, there was the added challenge of apartheid architecture. Now, apartheid architecture was a system of segregation that was actually pretty creative in how it effectively deprived one group of economic opportunities and enabled the other group through housing policies. So there was something called the 40-40 rule, where they would build these 40 square meter homes and put it 40 kilometers away from the city center, which then forced the Black native South Africans to spend 40% of their income commuting to work. And these were designed as the old Jewish ghettos in Europe where they had a curfew. They had to be back by 6. They couldn't be in town because that was their master's place. Only white South Africans could live there. And in addition to all these structural things, because now you're spending 40% of your income commuting to work, it disenfranchises you from being able to develop your own community. And these communities were designed intentionally deprived from parks, from gathering spaces, from economic opportunities, so that the subjects of them would be dependent on the white minority which ran the system and the towns. And in addition to that, what they did was they built these giant beer halls right next to mines and where men worked. So these already emasculated men who are frustrated by being oppressed in their own land and in their own country would get paid. And since there was a beer hall right next door, there was a great incentive. They'll just drink their problems away, which further took away money from black communities and black neighborhoods. Now, what's interesting is that apartheid ended in 1994, some 27 years post-apartheid. Just because the legislations changed doesn't mean the communities all of a sudden changed and came closer to economic opportunities. These are still the communities with the lowest income in South Africa. Our parents who live there still spend 40% of their income commuting to work in town. So just because laws change doesn't mean the buildings have changed. And that's why you're starting to see the role and the significance of architecture in the global scheme of politics. And there's a similar thing that happened in America with redlining and the projects. Right. The only difference is that within South Africa, these houses were plugged right by each other. In America, they built these giant towers, right, which became the projects back in the 1950s and 1960s. It's fundamentally important for us to realize that architecture has played a significant role in perpetuating segregation and perpetuating white supremacy. I saw a lot of people when protests were happening with Black Lives Matter and all these different movements that are going on, and everyone's like, oh man, the police. We need to defund the police, architects to defund the police. And we absolved ourselves of any responsibility. Look, I think there's definitely structural problems that need to be solved within the police department, but we as architects also have a responsibility to bring about change. These segregated neighborhoods did not design themselves. They did not create themselves. Because when you look at neighborhoods such as Levittown, when you look at redlining in places such as the south side of Chicago, when there was a white flight, right, and white people were given incentive to buy houses and be able to accumulate and build wealth for their families, the opposite was happening in black neighborhoods. So due to the lack of economic opportunities, the moving away of stores, the moving away of jobs, of course, you're going to have higher crime rates. Poor schools, because schools are funded by taxes. And poor schools led to higher dropout rates. Higher dropout rates, due to scarcity of work, led to higher crime rates. Higher crime rates justifies higher police presence. Higher police presence statistically in America leads to higher police brutality amongst black and BIPOC people. So you're starting to see how we've contributed to the problem that we're seeing today. I think Churchill puts it best when he said, we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape who we are. What type of buildings are we shaping? What type of neighborhoods are we shaping? What type of communities are we shaping with the architecture that we're doing? So it was important for us to learn from all of these lessons and do the opposite of what that looked like. So the first thing we did, we came up with this design approach called listening to build. Now, listening to build is us really engaging and working with the community, not just the elders in the community, but we met with the high school kids within the community, the college folks who were within the local school of architecture. We met with the go-go's, the grandmas, we met with the community leaders, and we had a public design charrette where we let them be the lead architects of designing their homes and communities. And we were mind blown by the ideas and innovation that came from people who already lived there. Because we believe that no one knows best where they're going to live than the people who are actually going to live there. And that's why it is imperative that we as architects need to be the conduits, the vehicle by which we bring the solution to life from the family that already exists and lives within that particular context. So listening to build was us really paying attention to how people are already solving their problems, not just only just listening to them from a vocal sense, but also paying attention to how they're solving their problem, paying attention to how they're living, paying attention to the social climate and socio-economic and socio-political climate. So this is just us working with communities and understanding the place and the context. and designing solutions that are culturally contextual and that are meaningful, that are emanating from the community rather than are imposed by us and our Eurocentric or Western perspective of what architecture ought to be. This is us now working with the Izindunas, walking around Umbumbulu, learning how the transportation works, learning how the community functions, learning about Ubuntu, this idea that I am because we are security challenges that exist within alcohol or drugs. And this is us talking to architecture students at the Durban University of Technology and learning from them how these communities ought to be shaped and understanding the challenges and the opportunities that lie within the design of such communities. So it's not just about listening to build, but it's also about building to enable, right? So, as I told you, the historic affordable housing is this box, which is 40 square meter home that you can never expand or add on. But what happens when the family grows in number and in economy? We are designing homes that are going to be a platform for growth, for families to succeed, not homes that are going to force families to stay within a low income bracket. So we design our homes anticipating growth, so they're flexible to add on, right? And each home that we build is not just a home. Could a home be more than just a home? Could it also be a revenue generating end? And each home we build has a commercial space to enable the family to financially sustain themselves. So that's why we build to enable. We build to enable opportunity. We build to enable commerce. We build to enable growth. We build to enable success. But really, when it comes to it, it's not just about building to enable only. It's enabling Ubuntu. I am because we are. It's enabling community. So it's not just about the home. It's not just about the commercial space. It's not just about the church or the park. It's about all of these things coming together and creating a vibrant, diverse neighborhoods that enable folks to thrive at all age groups from all different backgrounds, right? So it's about this holistic urban design and holistic community that comes together and works together to create a place where people can thrive. We started looking at that particular neighborhoods, like could a space that is unsafe for girls, where when they walk they feel unsafe or they could get robbed, could it be a place where they feel safe, where the grandmas can be able to come and sell fruits and vegetables, a place of opportunity, a vibrant place where the community can gather? Could a dilapidated bush be more than just that? Could it create economic opportunities for local craftsmen, for local tailors, and partner them with local and international retailers, not just letting international retailers come and take over, but how do we diversify and create opportunities for the local community? Could we create a community center built on traditional Zulu values and start to revive some of the historic building language and teach folks about their culture and history, and create a community center where people can have church, have weddings, have meetings? Could a fence be more than just a fence? Could it be a place that creates economic opportunities for people going to get social grants at the end of the month? Could it be a place that enables commerce and dignity and safety? And this is our proposal for the Umbumbulu community, where it's not just about, designing something that could be anywhere. It's about designing a space and a place that reflects the culture, the shared value for Zulu people that is rooted in who they are. So when you look at this development, this is the development we propose. You cannot take this development and put it in Chicago. You cannot put it in Rome, because it's inherently Umbumbulu. And how do we build communities that have the cultural value intact? Now, what was exciting is we got to work with this amazing family called the Mthiyane family. And it's a family living with disability. Mr. Mthiyane was in a car accident in 1997 and has been in a wheelchair since. Mrs. Mthiyane was born with unequal legs, and so cannot walk long distances. But Mrs. Mthiyane had worked at a daycare for 10 years. So they had given away their 15-year-old son at the time because they just didn't have suitable living conditions for him. So we worked with them, and the community had cookouts as we were designing. We brought everyone over. They started telling us, like, no, We don't have this concept of a dining room and a sitting room, that the sitting room is also the dining room, and it's a very more male-geared space versus the kitchen, which is a feminine space, which is rooted in traditional Zulu homesteads. And we started drawing all of these patterns and not imposing, but learning from and reflecting what the family was telling us about how their home would look like. And we designed this amazing handicap-accessible home, affordable home for the Charlie family. So this is their home. It's a home with a commercial space. The commercial space, we made it into a daycare because Mrs. Charlie had worked with a daycare. The daycare had 18 kids just at opening. They've over tripled their income. They've been able to take that money and now build a whole new facility, right? They're now, which means 18 mothers can now go to work as they send their kids to school. They are now living with their son who's now going to college, which was something that was not on the horizon. They now have a car. And every time we visit them, we just see this progression and success. And that's when you start realizing that it's not that people are lazy. It's not that people cannot create for themselves. They just need the platform of a dignified home for them to be able to thrive. And what's beautiful is, remember that student who raised up their hand and said, I don't want to live next to Bam? Well, I took him to South Africa with us with Andrew's master's architecture class, and he ended up being one of the leads in designing and helping us build this home. And I remember sobbing when he came down to Mpumbula and saying, oh, I get it now. Architecture isn't just about walkable streets in San Francisco, but architecture has the power to change lives. You know, you don't get that until you start seeing yourself in the people that you're designing for. It's this idea of Ubuntu, that I am because we are, where you realize that our lives are interdependent on each other, our success is interdependent on each other. It's that humility that we need within architecture in order for us to create neighborhoods and places that serve people rather than serve our egos. One of the most fundamental things that happened during this time is we had students who come from white neighborhoods come and help us build this. And with the history of South Africa and apartheid, that is very unique to happen. And I remember them pulling me aside and saying, you know, we wouldn't otherwise actually, you know, come to this neighborhood because of what we've been told by our parents. But we've been here for a couple of days now. We've never felt more at home. We've never felt more loved. And this started to build bridges and change perceptions and heal wounds that were created by apartheid. That's when you start seeing the power of design and the power of architecture.